A colored elderly woman never imagined that a peaceful afternoon in the park would turn into a nightmare when two aggressive police officers suddenly accused her without reason. Before she could explain, she was thrown to the ground, handcuffed, and treated brutally. But the story doesn't end there. Just when it seemed like injustice had reached its peak, a stranger intervened. And that stranger was none other than the legend, Mike Tyson. What happens next will make you unbelievable. Stay tuned to witness how courage and compassion can turn the tide against injustice. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and share where you're watching from in the comments section. Your support will help us bring more meaningful stories like this. Mike Tyson, the legendary former boxer, often comes to Greenwood Park every afternoon after training sessions to relax and enjoy the peaceful atmosphere. With a tumultuous past and a glorious career, Mike cherishes these tranquil moments in everyday life. It's where he sets aside the limelight, sheds the pressure of fame, and finds balance for his soul. That afternoon, as he leisurely walked along the tree-lined path, he inadvertently heard shouting from a bench near the pond. He stopped, his sharp eyes looking toward the source of the noise. There, two police officers, Blake and Carter, were loudly confronting an elderly woman. She sat on a stone bench, appearing frail and small. Just as she began to speak, one of the officers grabbed her arm and forcefully pulled her, causing her to lose balance and tumble to the ground. Mike didn't know who she was, but the scene made his blood boil. The elderly woman, with her graying hair and fearful eyes, reminded him of powerless moments from his past when he was looked down upon because of his circumstances and background. Anger surged as he saw Blake continue to handcuff her roughly, despite her trembling attempts to explain. A few people in the park stopped to watch, but no one dared to intervene. Some took out their phones to record, but everyone stood from a distance. Mike narrowed his eyes, stepped quickly towards them, thinking to himself, I can't let this continue. As he approached, his eyes that once made the toughest opponents in the ring tremble, filled with determination. Mike stopped for a few seconds, observing the actions of the two officers, then calmly spoke up, Hey, what are you guys doing? She's just sitting on a bench. Is this how you enforce justice? The two officers, initially not recognizing who he was, turned to look with annoyance. Carter raised an eyebrow, his voice cold. It's not your business. Move aside before you get in trouble. Mike took a deep breath, keeping his voice calm but firm. This is not how you treat an elderly person, especially when she hasn't done anything wrong. Let her go right now. Blake smirked, turning to Carter. Look, this guy thinks he's a hero. He doesn't even know who this old lady is. Carter sneered, looking Mike up and down. We're police officers. We don't need outsiders directing us. If you don't want trouble, you'd better leave. Mike tightened his fists but remained calm. He knew anger wouldn't resolve the situation, but he was also clear that he wouldn't walk away. He stood there, a symbol of strength, ready to face anything to protect this innocent woman. A familiar thought echoed in his mind, if I do nothing, who will stand up for her? Mike Tyson kept his steely gaze, took another step toward the elderly woman, positioning himself between her and the two officers. The elderly woman, with a haggard face and handcuffed, looked up at Mike with eyes both scared and hopeful. He leaned down, gently asked, Are you okay? What did they do to you? Before she could respond, Officer Carter intervened with a challenging tone, I already told you, back off. You're obstructing law enforcement. Mike looked up, his eyes resolute. Obstructing what? You have no legitimate reason to arrest her. You haven't even explained or provided any evidence. I can't stand by and watch you abuse your power like this. Officer Blake took a step back, looking uneasy as the crowd around them grew. Many people had taken out their phones to record, however, he still tried to maintain his arrogance. Listen, big guy, this isn't your business. If you don't want trouble, you should leave before we have to use force. Mike stood tall, his voice deep and decisive. I'm not someone you can threaten. I'm here to protect her and stop you from doing wrong. Don't do anything you'll regret. At this moment, a few murmurs arose from the crowd. That's Mike Tyson. He's protecting the old lady. Realizing the attention was focused on him, Officer Carter became impatient. He advanced, trying to push Mike out of the way, but to Carter's surprise, Mike didn't budge. Instead, he remained in place, his eyes cold as in the boxing ring. "I'm not going anywhere. If you want to explain, do it now. Otherwise, I suggest you let her go." Carter, with his usual arrogance, shouted loudly, "Who do you think you are? Just because you're famous doesn't mean you have the right to interfere in our work." Mike chuckled softly, but his eyes remained sharp. "Who I am doesn't matter. What matters is that I can't let you continue treating an innocent person unjustly. Look around you. Everyone's recording what you're doing. Do you want this to go viral?" Blake looked at the crowd, where some people had started chanting, "Let her go. Stop this abuse of power." Carter still tried to act tough. "I don't care. You're obstructing the police, and that could get you in trouble." Mike gently leaned forward, staring straight into Carter's eyes, his voice filled with authority. "I'm not afraid of trouble, especially when I'm doing the right thing. But you should be afraid. What you're doing today won't just affect your jobs but also destroy public trust in the entire police force." Mike Tyson continued to hold his ground, standing between the elderly woman and the two officers. The surrounding crowd grew larger, the murmurs turning into loud calls for justice. A young woman held her phone high, shouting, "They're abusing their power. Let her go right now." A middle-aged man stepped forward, eyes full of anger. "She's just sitting quietly on the bench. You have no reason to arrest her." Officer Blake and Carter began to feel increasing pressure as all eyes turned toward them. Carter, still maintaining a harsh tone, yelled, "Back off. All of you are obstructing us from doing our job. If you don't leave right now, we'll arrest you for causing a disturbance." These threats didn't calm the crowd, but made them angrier. An elderly woman in the crowd, her voice trembling but determined, shouted loudly, "No one is afraid of you. This isn't justice, this is abuse of power." Mike stood firm, looking straight into Carter's eyes. He took another step, his voice decisive, "Let her go. Everyone here is watching. If you don't want this action to ruin your careers, stop now." Carter looked to Blake, appearing confused, but instead of stopping, Blake sternly replied, "Put her in the car. We can't let them think we're scared." Carter nodded, moving toward the elderly woman, but before he could act, Mike stepped forward quickly, blocking his path. The crowd cheered, voices echoing. At that moment, from afar, the sound of police sirens blared. A patrol car stopped, and a middle-aged man with a stern expression stepped out. It was Lieutenant Taylor, Blake and Carter's superior. He approached, his eyes scanning the crowd before focusing on Mike and the two officers. "What's going on here?" Taylor asked, his voice deep but authoritative. Blake turned to Taylor, looking relieved. "Sir, we're trying to apprehend a suspect, but this guy has been obstructing and inciting the crowd." Mike stepped forward, looking directly at Taylor, his voice calm but strong. "They're not arresting a suspect, they're abusing their power. She's just sitting quietly on a bench, not doing anything wrong." Instead of investigating, they used violence, threw her to the ground, and handcuffed her without reason. Taylor looked at the elderly woman, who was still trembling, her eyes full of fear. He turned back to Blake and Carter, asking, "Do you have any reason to arrest her? Any evidence or reports?" Blake stammered, We thought she might be a suspect who escaped earlier this morning. We acted on instinct." Taylor raised an eyebrow, his eyes cold. "Instinct? Or are you just looking for an easy target? I want to see your exact reports right now." Blake and Carter remained silent, unable to speak. Taylor turned to Mike. "Thank you, Mr. Tyson, for stepping in. I will handle this immediately. Thank you for helping us uphold justice." Taylor then ordered the two officers to immediately remove the handcuffs and leave this place. "I will handle you two later." Blake reluctantly removed the handcuffs from the elderly woman, while Carter backed away, looking uneasy. The crowd erupted in cheers. Someone shouted loudly, "Mike Tyson is our hero." Mike didn't show excitement, he bent down, gently helping the elderly woman up. "Are you okay? I'll make sure you're safe." The elderly woman nodded gently, tears rolling down her cheeks. Mike helped her stand, leading her out of the park amid the crowd's cheers, but he knew this story was far from over. As Mike Tyson helped the elderly woman sit down on a bench away from the scene, he turned back to face the crowd and Lieutenant Taylor. His eyes were no longer just filled with anger but with determination and responsibility. The crowd, though calmer, still awaited what would happen next. Mike stepped forward, his voice deep and resonant. Today, we witnessed something that shouldn't happen: abuse of power. An elderly woman who did nothing wrong was harassed and beaten by those who were supposed to protect her. If you weren't here, would this have stopped? Would justice have been served? The crowd responded with supportive cheers. A man shouted, "We always see this happening, but no one ever stands up." Mike nodded, his eyes scanning the people around him. That's why I can't stay silent. This isn't the first time things like this have happened, but it must be the last time we let it happen without fighting back. I don't know this woman, but I know she didn't deserve to be treated like that, and I know we all have a responsibility to protect what's right. Lieutenant Taylor stepped forward, raising his hand to request silence. His voice echoed, "I understand your outrage. I'm a police officer too, and I'm ashamed to witness the actions of my two colleagues. What happened today does not reflect the values of our force. I promise to conduct a thorough investigation and hold those responsible accountable." Mike stepped closer, his sharp eyes meeting Taylor's. Promises are good, but actions are better. I hope you do what you say, not only to address these two officers but to look at the entire system that allowed such behavior to exist. Taylor paused for a moment, then nodded. You're right. I will personally oversee this investigation. Abuse of power will not be tolerated under any circumstances. Mike turned back to the crowd, where all eyes remained on him. With the calm of a champion, he said, "We can't let things like this continue. The police aren't our enemies, but those who abuse their power within the force need to be removed. Today, we stood up together. Let's continue to maintain this unity, not only to protect the vulnerable but to ensure that no one has to live in fear." Applause erupted from the crowd. A young woman held up her phone, filming and declaring loudly, "Mike Tyson isn't just a legendary boxer, he's a hero of justice." A middle-aged man shouted, "We stand with you, Mike. Justice must be served." Mike turned back to help the elderly woman stand up. She was still trembling, but her eyes were less fearful. She looked at Mike, her voice hoarse, "Thank you, young man. I didn't know what would happen without you." Mike smiled gently, his voice full of reassurance. "No need to thank me, ma'am. I was just doing what anyone should do." He slowly led her out of the park, while the crowd remained, some continuing to film and comment. Mike knew that his actions today were just a small step, but they had planted hope in the hearts of those who witnessed. For him, protecting justice wasn't the responsibility of one person but of the entire community. As Mike left, Taylor turned back to Blake and Carter, his voice growing colder. "You two better be ready. This won't be ignored. You've brought shame to our entire police force." Carter tried to object, but Taylor raised his hand to stop him. "I don't want to hear any excuses. We will handle this properly. Now, leave this place immediately." Blake and Carter, now devoid of any pride, reluctantly left the park under the scornful gazes of the crowd. Mike Tyson, on his way to ensure the elderly woman got home safely, thought about what had just happened. He knew he wasn't the one to change the entire system, but today's small action had created a significant impact. And that's how change begins, from a brave action, from a decision not to remain silent in the face of injustice. As Mike Tyson left with the elderly woman, the incident in the park quickly spread across social media, thanks to the videos recorded by the crowd. Within hours, images and footage capturing the two officers abusing their power, along with Mike Tyson's stand for justice, became the center of public attention. Public pressure forced the police department to take immediate action. Lieutenant Taylor decided to suspend officers Blake and Carter pending an investigation. An independent investigation team from the Department of the Interior was established to thoroughly examine the officers' actions and the management system's shortcomings. The investigation team quickly gathered evidence, including videos from the crowd, testimonies from Mike Tyson and Mrs. Martha Johnson, and the previous records of Blake and Carter. The crowd's videos clearly showed the elderly woman sitting quietly on the bench with no suspicious actions, while the two officers used unnecessary force by throwing her to the ground and handcuffing her. Testimonies from Mrs. Martha and Mike Tyson further reinforced the evidence of the officers' brutality and disregard. The investigation also found that Blake and Carter had multiple past complaints regarding abuse of power, but these complaints were often ignored or dismissed lightly. Small protests took place outside the police station, with banners demanding justice and police reform. The media continuously reported on the incident, and Mike Tyson became the voice representing the vulnerable. In an interview, he shared that those without a voice need to be protected, not threatened. Mike's words stirred public opinion, and human rights organizations also joined in applying pressure, demanding the police department provide transparent answers. Blake and Carter were summoned to appear before an internal disciplinary committee. Blake tried to defend himself, claiming they were just doing their duty and acted swiftly to ensure public safety. However, the videos from the scene disproved this defense. The committee pointed out that they had no specific evidence related to Mrs. Martha and had bypassed all basic verification procedures. Carter tried to plead for forgiveness, but Lieutenant Taylor asserted that opportunities had been given multiple times before and that their actions had destroyed public trust in the police force. Ultimately, the disciplinary committee decided to dismiss Blake and Carter for abuse of power and severe violations of professional ethics. Their records were forwarded to the Department of Justice for consideration of criminal charges for unlawful use of force and human rights violations. This decision was publicly announced, and the police department committed to reforms to prevent similar incidents in the future. When asked about this outcome, Mike Tyson responded that it was a step in the right direction. He hoped it would send a strong message to all who abused their power that the era of silence was over. Mike continued to engage in community activities, advocating for reform and using his influence to promote change. For him, this incident wasn't just a confrontation in the park but a reminder that justice always needs to be protected, no matter who stands up to fight for it. The event in the park and Mike Tyson's strong actions became a catalyst for a wave of change within the police system. Under public pressure and Lieutenant Taylor's commitment to reform, the police department began a comprehensive renewal plan to restore community trust. Lieutenant Taylor announced that all officers would participate in mandatory training programs on professional ethics, cultural awareness, and nonviolent crisis intervention skills. These lessons emphasized that the role of the police is not to dominate but to protect and serve the community. A new complaint handling system was established, allowing citizens to report abuse of power anonymously. All complaints would be thoroughly reviewed and independently investigated by an external committee to ensure transparency. Officers were encouraged to report colleagues who engaged in wrongdoing without fear of retaliation. Mike Tyson, though not an official part of the police force, became a strong advocate for these reform efforts. He regularly appeared at community meetings, sharing his story and urging people to continue fighting for justice. In a speech before a crowd, he said, "This isn't just about an elderly woman in a park, this is about all of us, about a system that needs to change. If we don't stand up, who will? Each one of us has a role in building a fairer community." Mike's presence at community meetings not only inspired but also attracted media attention, keeping the issue of reform in the spotlight. He emphasized that real change requires time and perseverance, but it can only be achieved if everyone works together. The changes began to yield significant results. Younger officers, especially newcomers, showed a stronger commitment to building relationships with the community. Many community police interaction programs were organized, helping both sides understand each other better and break down prejudices. Officers participated in meetings at schools, churches, and residential areas to listen to the concerns and opinions of the public. Mrs. Martha Johnson, the woman who had been a victim in the park incident, became a symbol of the fight for justice. She joined community meetings alongside Mike Tyson, sharing her experience and urging people not to stay silent in the face of injustice. The story of Mike Tyson and Mrs. Martha didn't just impact the city where the incident occurred but spread nationwide. It became a symbol of unity, demonstrating that one individual can make a significant difference by standing up against injustice. On social media, hashtags like #JusticeForMartha and #StandWithMike became movements, encouraging people to share their own stories of facing injustice and fighting for what's right. Mike continued his role as a leader in reform movements. He not only advocated for changes within the police system but also encouraged educational and community organizations to develop programs that help youth understand the values of fairness and respect. Mrs. Martha, now recovered both physically and mentally, lived a more peaceful life, always protected and respected by the community. She often said, "That day, I thought I wouldn't see another tomorrow, but Mike stood up, and thanks to him, I regained my faith in people and justice." The story of Mike Tyson and Mrs. Martha is a testament to the power of courage and unity. It shows that no matter how difficult the circumstances, justice will prevail if someone is willing to stand up for what's right. Changes in the system can't happen overnight, but with each action, each voice, a fairer society can be built. Mike, reflecting on what had happened, wasn't proud of his fame or achievements. What satisfied him most was not turning his back when facing injustice. Doing the right thing and knowing that his small action had given hope to many made him feel fulfilled. He smiled, continuing his journey in the fight for justice, knowing this was just the beginning of what was to come. The story of Mike Tyson and Mrs. Martha is not only a testament to individual bravery but also a symbol of community strength when standing up against injustice. It reminds us that in a world sometimes rife with unfairness, even a small action can make a significant difference. No matter who you are, where you are, or what you do, you can always contribute to making society better. We learn that justice doesn't exist naturally but needs to be protected and fought for every day. Through unity, trust, and perseverance, everyone can help build a world where compassion, fairness, and respect are always prioritized. If this story touched your heart, share it to spread this positive message to more people. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button on our channel so you don't miss out on more inspiring and meaningful life stories. Let's create change together, starting today. This completes the text from the file. Let me know if there's anything more you'd like or if I can assist with other tasks. You said. Increase it, continue. ChatGPT said. ChatGPT. Here's an extension to the story, maintaining the tone and theme of resilience, courage, and community change. Months after the incident, Mike Tyson's stand in the park had become a cultural phenomenon. News channels, blogs, and social media continued discussing his actions and the broader implications for accountability in law enforcement. Documentaries were made about his life, highlighting how his journey from a troubled youth to a champion boxer had now entered a new phase of advocacy for justice and reform. His willingness to act in the face of abuse inspired countless people, from young activists to retired community members, to stand against injustice in their own ways. Mike didn't limit his work to appearances or speeches. He became actively involved in organizing workshops and training sessions for police officers in nearby districts. He collaborated with professionals in psychology, law, and social work to design programs emphasizing empathy, communication, and the power of nonviolent approaches to policing. "If an old fighter like me can find a way to protect others without force," Mike would tell the officers, "then it's possible for everyone to use their strength to heal and not harm." As part of his new advocacy, Mike set up a foundation that offered scholarships to young people from marginalized communities who aspired to become leaders in social justice or law enforcement. His hope was that this new generation would prioritize serving with integrity, valuing the trust of the people they vowed to protect. He regularly attended meetings with community leaders and police officials to keep the momentum of change alive. Mrs. Martha Johnson, with Mike's encouragement, shared her story at schools, churches, and community centers, encouraging people not to stay silent. Her speeches were raw and powerful, as she recounted the feelings of helplessness she experienced that day and how Mike's bravery helped restore her faith in humanity. "We may feel powerless, but together, we're anything but weak," she would say to applause. Her words, like Mike's, resonated with many who had experienced fear or felt abandoned by those who should protect them. The changes inspired by Mike Tyson's actions continued to unfold in unexpected ways. Local governments across the country began implementing stricter oversight for police conduct, and a wave of policies emerged supporting transparency and community involvement. Monthly town hall meetings were established in communities with high rates of complaints against police to allow residents to express their concerns directly to local law enforcement. This open dialogue led to an improvement in relationships between officers and the communities they served, fostering mutual respect and understanding. Over time, the hashtag #StandWithMike continued to trend, sparking conversations worldwide. Activists in other countries began using his story as an example to push for reforms in their regions. The positive impact of his stance reached far beyond his own community, and he began receiving invitations from organizations around the world to speak on justice and the importance of action. Mike often reflected on his journey. Growing up, he had never imagined himself as a fighter for justice, he was simply trying to survive. But now, with each small victory, he saw how his life's path had uniquely prepared him for this role. He knew the struggle against abuse of power wasn't new, but he also knew that standing up could spark transformation. One evening, Mike organized a reunion at Greenwood Park, inviting everyone who had been there on that fateful day. The park had become a powerful symbol in the community, a reminder of their collective strength. Hundreds gathered, including Mrs. Martha, Lieutenant Taylor, and many of the young people who had been inspired by Mike's words. Together, they celebrated not only the changes that had been made but also the bond that had been forged among them. Standing before the crowd, Mike shared a final message: "I'm just one man, but each of you is one, too. The world doesn't change because of heroes. It changes because of people who refuse to be silent. Keep standing up. Keep showing up. And remember that kindness is the greatest strength any of us can have." The crowd cheered, and Mike Tyson smiled, humbled by the powerful movement he had helped ignite. He knew that the fight for justice was ongoing, but he also knew that, with the courage of many, true change was possible. As the years passed, the Greenwood Park incident remained a powerful turning point, not only for the people involved but for the broader movement toward justice and accountability. Mike Tyson, though still remembered for his legendary boxing career, had become more widely recognized for his tireless work in the fight for fairness and the protection of the vulnerable. His journey was far from over, and the impact of his stand in that park continued to unfold in ways that no one could have anticipated. In the wake of the incident, the police department under Lieutenant Taylor's leadership underwent significant reforms. The department's commitment to transparency became a model for law enforcement agencies across the country. The introduction of mandatory body cameras for all officers, better training in de-escalation tactics, and the establishment of independent review boards empowered citizens to hold officers accountable. But perhaps the most important change was the shift in mindset. Officers were now trained to see themselves not as enforcers of power but as protectors of the people, regardless of their background or appearance. Mike Tyson's influence extended beyond public speeches and reform initiatives. He became a mentor to young police officers, offering one-on-one guidance on how to connect with the community they served. Through his mentorship programs, he helped instill in them a sense of empathy and duty that transcended the typical us versus them mentality. He often said, "Real strength is not in how tough you look on the outside, but in how you show up for people when they need you the most." In addition to working with police forces, Mike expanded his advocacy to include youth outreach programs aimed at preventing crime and violence before they even began. His foundation worked to provide opportunities for young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, particularly in high-risk neighborhoods, to access education, mentorship, and careers in public service. Through sports, arts, and educational initiatives, Mike helped channel the energy of young people into positive outlets, empowering them to become leaders of change in their communities. Mrs. Martha, too, remained at the forefront of this movement. She continued to attend town halls, speaking out about her experiences and encouraging others to share their stories. Her efforts resonated with people from all walks of life, and she became a beacon of resilience and hope for those who had been mistreated by the system. In recognition of her courage, local schools named awards in her honor, celebrating students who embodied the values of empathy, justice, and perseverance. Every year, she returned to the park where the incident had occurred to lay flowers, not only as a tribute to the events of that day but as a reminder that justice is an ongoing pursuit. The Greenwood Park incident continued to be taught in schools, not just as a story of one woman's encounter with injustice, but as a lesson on the importance of standing up for what is right. Mike and Mrs. Martha's actions were incorporated into curricula that discuss civil rights, the power of individual action, and the responsibility of citizens to act when they see injustice. Students read about how a simple act of bravery sparked a nationwide conversation on police reform and how it ultimately led to real changes in communities across the country. But the story didn't end with just one victory. Across the country, citizens began to take matters into their own hands, pushing for reforms at the local, state, and federal levels. The hashtag Justice for Martha and hashtag Stand With Mike hashtags continued to trend on social media, inspiring people from all walks of life to share their experiences and demand better treatment from law enforcement. A nationwide coalition of activists, human rights organizations, and grassroots movements emerged, working together to push for comprehensive police reform. They called for new laws that mandated better police accountability, funding for mental health services, and programs designed to build stronger relationships between police officers and the communities they served. Through his work, Mike Tyson not only helped change the way people viewed law enforcement, but he also demonstrated the true meaning of leadership. He understood that creating lasting change required collaboration, persistence, and a willingness to listen. He worked alongside community leaders, lawyers, and even critics of the police system to help craft legislation that addressed systemic issues within law enforcement. These efforts culminated in the passing of the Mike Tyson Justice Reform Act, a landmark piece of legislation that redefined policing standards, set stricter requirements for the use of force, and established independent oversight boards to ensure that police departments operated with transparency and accountability. Over time, the changes instigated by the Greenwood Park incident began to show tangible results. Crime rates in neighborhoods with significant police-community relations programs dropped dramatically. Officers, now more engaged with their communities, became trusted figures rather than feared ones. Young people who had once seen the police as their enemies began to see them as protectors, and the cycle of mistrust began to heal. Mike's own journey continued to evolve. As a father and husband, he often reflected on how different the world could be for his children. He wanted them to grow up in a society where people respected one another and stood up for each other in times of need. He frequently took his children to the communities he worked with, showing them firsthand the impact of kindness, leadership, and justice. He encouraged them to always be advocates for those who couldn't speak for themselves, reminding them that their actions, no matter how small, could change the world. Years later, Mike returned to Greenwood Park, not as a boxer or a hero in the traditional sense, but as a man who had dedicated his life to making the world a better place. The park, which had once been the scene of a brutal confrontation, was now a symbol of the power of community unity and action. A small plaque near the pond bore his name alongside Mrs. Martha's, commemorating the day that they had stood together, changed lives, and sparked a movement that would echo for generations. In the years following, Mike Tyson's legacy was solidified as one of resilience, redemption, and a commitment to social justice. The story of an elderly woman's fight for dignity, of a man who found his new purpose, and of a community's collective stand against injustice became a defining moment in the history of the nation's movement for civil rights. It wasn't just a chapter in the fight for justice, it was the beginning of a new era in which compassion, fairness, and respect became the foundation of the society we all strive to build.